So, last night, I may have pissed off an ancient Eldritch horror. But who hasn't? In my defense, the damn thing shouldn't have chosen my backyard as a site for its elemental regeneration. There are better, more desolate places in which to rebuild yourself, atom by wretched atom, than the finely trimmed backyard of a suburban home. I was just sitting there on a patio chair, looking up at the stars and listening to music in my Bluetooth earbuds, not bothering anyone, minding my own terrestrial business, when out of absolutely nothing came a shimmering mass of particles. A cloud of near-blinding incandescence, situated 6 or 7 feet in the air, in the middle of the backyard I had just finished cutting. Obviously, I took notice and got up from my seat, more mesmerized than startled. The cloud did nothing for a while, beyond shimmering. So, I stood by, expecting something. Eventually, after achieving some kind of spectral order or arrangement, the cloud, its composite particles, froze in mid-air, becoming some kind of ruin or icon, a purplish symbol, its edges crackling like fireworks. I was a little alarmed by this, since it became clear then that there was an intelligence or will behind the thing, that it wasn't just some bizarre but otherwise natural phenomenon. The music I was listening to wasn't exactly appropriate for the strange, eerie occasion, so I plucked out my earbuds and put them in their case, and was then reminded that I owned a phone and should probably be calling someone right about then, and of course recording. Keeping my eyes on the sparkling but otherwise static icon, I slowly backed away, intending to grab my phone and start filming the thing. I hadn't yet thought of who I'd call. I figured the answer would come to me eventually. Just when I reached the table, whereon my phone sat, almost fully charged, the rune symbol thing flashed, briefly becoming brilliantly white, and I instinctively brought my hands to my face to shield my eyes from the blinding lights. In that brief moment, the symbol had changed, was now less angled, rounder, and its color had become a weird, honestly indescribable admixture of purple, green and silver. A color that, for lack of a better word, was very alien. Fearing that I'd missed the chance to film yet another shift in its form, I spun around and grabbed my phone. But, despite tapping the screen, holding the power button, and even pressing the volume and power button simultaneously, the phone wouldn't turn on. The battery had somehow died, or had been depleted by some draining force. I'm not stupid. I've been called dumb, short-sighted, and a host of other similarly defined words. But I'm not stupid. I was able to immediately connect my phone battery's sudden depletion with the weird anomaly, sensing that the incident had been done intentionally. I decided to approach and engage with the symbol, if possible, hoping to somehow communicate. With my heart pounding to some tech death rhythm, I cautiously approached the symbol, noticing for the first time how the space around it seemed to bend, as if it exerted some level of control over the atmosphere and/or gravity. Strangely, it didn't cast any light beyond its immediate area. Despite glowing brightly, the yard itself was still dark. Shadows lingered freely. Reaching the floating symbol, I slowly put out a hand toward it, expecting to feel a sensation of intense heat. But there wasn't any, not even a soft warmth, like what you would feel a few inches from a typical light bulb. The thing glowed, burned, and gave off sparks where its weird lines intersected. And yet, there was no accompanying heat emission. A little more confident, I reached closer, still ready to withdraw at the first sensation, heat or otherwise. My fingers continued on, feeling only the cool air of the night. Until finally, my forefinger touched one of the lines. It was surprisingly solid, and not hot at all. There was even a hint of cold to it, like something that had been recently in the fridge and still carried a little of its chill on the surface. When nothing happened to my pointer finger, I allowed the others to extend, and finally gripped the length of the segment with my hand. This, of course, was a terrible idea. It nearly cost me my life. Just as I took hold of the floating length of light, the whole symbol abruptly rearranged, and my hand became trapped in the newly formed three-dimensional image, the lines becoming a cage from which I couldn't remove my hand. There was no pressure, no accompanying pain, and yet the inability to free my hand nonetheless inspired a mounting panic. The more I struggled, the more panicked I became, and before long, I was shouting for help. But my cries tapered off into the night as I realized that sound wasn't escaping the immediate area. There was no echo of my voice going off into the night. Like light, sound couldn't escape the weird microcosm around the symbol. Unsure of what to do, but knowing that I needed to remove my hand as quickly as possible, I tried to flex my hand, thinking that maybe further input would cause the lines to once again reform and allow me to slip my hand out in the brief interim between. But nothing happened. No matter how widely I splayed my fingers, no matter how tightly I closed my fist, the lines, like bars of hard light, remained locked around my wrist, keeping my hand imprisoned within their confines. Just when the idea of self-amputation arose in my mind, the lines again shifted into an even less describable color, and new, independently existent segments of line appeared above and below the cage. These, unlike the other lines, remained solid in color and luminosity. None of them crackled and fizzled, but emitted a constant glow of their own. I immediately got the impression that they were seals of some kind, arcane locks, and another impression immediately arrived on the heels of this one. Guided by some outre instinct, I opened my hand from the fist I had formed and positioned the fingers into a hand gesture I hadn't even made before. Then, I slowly turned my hand counterclockwise and watched, both amazed and horrified, as my hand continued turning beyond the rotational limits of my wrist. My entire body tensed, readying itself for a pain I was sure I'd feel. But even as my hand made its third full rotation, no pain arose. There was no agony of dislocation or severance. The skin of my wrist wasn't torn from the impossible movement. It was a bizarre, unsettling sight. But after the fifth rotation, I relaxed a little and finally took notice of the peripheral seals, which had been rotating in tandem with my wrist the whole time. Finally, after the seventh rotation, my hand went still, and the seals lost their glow and disintegrated, the particles falling away to nothingness before my eyes. A moment later, the cage expanded, releasing my hand. I quickly pulled it back and instinctively rubbed my wrist, even though I hadn't actually been harmed and felt no pain. The cage-like arrangement of lines continued to expand until it filled most of my backyard, nearly dwarfing the tree at the rear. Its incandescence was dizzying, imparted a weird, almost intoxicating sensation, and I suddenly had the conflicting impulses to both peer into its hollow interior and turn fully away from it. The former eventually won out, and I found myself gazing, almost longingly, into that center, as if my body wanted to experience the imprisonment my hand briefly felt. But thankfully, before I could act on this self-sacrificial impulse, something appeared within the cage's interior. Something that immediately and horrifically dispelled my desire to approach the glowing cage. Floating within the cage, hovering malignantly, was a giant mouth. Beneath massive, snake-like black lips jutting from blood-red gums were teeth, fangs, the largest bigger than my head. Saliva, thick and green-tinged, oozed from between the teeth, dripping into nothing below the bottom lip, as if the dreadful substance couldn't exist outside the barrier of the cage. A tongue, white and crimson, undulated within the dragon-toothed maw, flicking fat droplets of saliva into the air. These two vanished upon reaching the limits of the spectral prison. There was nothing else, only the abyssal mouth and its hyper-lethal-looking fangs. And still, I somehow overcame my terror and revulsion, and felt myself wanting to come closer, to enter the cage and climb headlong into that evilly ravenous maw. 1 foot, another, 3 more, and then I was there, standing before the cage, within the aberrant micro-atmosphere exuded by its spectral power. The mouth was massive, even larger than I had first perceived. A cavernous opening rimmed with ivory stalactites and stalagmites, its depths seemingly endless. A call for it gullet beyond space and time. I knew that it wanted me to climb in, gleaned that I was to serve a further purpose. I had pried its cell into the real world, had unlocked the outer gate, and just needed to feed myself to it so that it could then muster enough of its power to exit the jail. And then it could devour the world, swallow it whole into its abyssal gullet. The urge to climb became a need, and a battle raged in my mind, my instincts for self-preservation fighting against a semi-conscious and wholly irrational logic to feed myself to the fiend. The thing waited patiently, as if confident that the irrational desire would win out in the end. As if it had imposed its demonic will upon countless others and had never been defeated. I too would have eventually succumbed, would have leapt headfirst into that saliva-soaked trap, if a breeze hadn't suddenly blown and carried the scent of gasoline to my nostrils. The lawnmower. I had left it parked by the patio, planning to take it in when I went inside after relaxing for a moment. Its gas cap must not have been tightly screwed, and thus the scent of lingering fumes had reached my nostrils, carried by the gust of wind. Briefly distracted, I came up with an idea and managed to wrench myself away from the mental pull of the monstrous maw. Struggling, as if resisted by buffeting winds, I slowly made my way toward the lawnmower, eyes filling with tears as every nerve of my being now screamed for me to return and throw myself onto the tongue, which my self-sabotaging mind assured me would be blissfully comfortable. But the deeper, more animal impetus of survival won out, and I reached the lawnmower. Providentially, I managed to start it on the first go, something I had never imagined to accomplish before. Positioning it so that its front faced the glowing cage and the salivating horror therein, I pushed on, allowing the sorcerous magnetism to carry me forward. I wasn't sure if the thing had any idea of what I was doing, if it could even see me. But I sensed no shift in its being, no change in its eagerness to swallow me whole. With the lawnmower roaring, I charged on, and then pulled all my weight into pushing down so that the front lifted up, the blades beneath spinning freely, lethally. What I hadn't expected, but what I greatly appreciated, was for the lawnmower to be lifted and drawn toward the mouth. Further evidence that the entity possessed some degree of control over gravity itself. I let go of the handle, and the machine was lifted and carried right into the mouth. And the blades quickly did the grim work I had hoped they'd do. The glistening lips and gums were promptly shredded by the still spinning blades. Whatever force that had seized the lawnmower had held the handle pressed down, keeping the lawnmower powered in my absence. The jagged teeth, while not broken, were cracked and chipped as the blade grinded against them. The tongue, in some pitiful attempt to push out the unwanted machine, lashed out but was quickly torn to pieces. It was an enjoyably gruesome display, and despite my terribly close brush with death, I started to laugh, elated that my plan was working so well. A moment later, the jaws clamped shut, and there followed the disconcerting sounds of wrenching, collapsing metal. Blood and gas leaked from beneath the shredded lips, and the whole orifice trembled, the vacuous space around it warping in accordance. Finally, the whole thing went inert, becoming only a floating pair of hideously tattered lips. The cage, either sensing the apparent death of its occupant or acting on some preset timer, first dulled and then collapsed, returning to the same size it had once been. The deadened lips disappeared in the implosion, leaving the cage empty. taking a guess at what I had to do next. I went over to it, and again reached in, this time turning my hand clockwise. The peripheral seals again reappeared, and my hand again underwent that impossible and painless rotation. On the 7th turn, it stopped, and I removed my hand. The cage, the prison of that would-be world devourer, then blinked from existence, taking the hopefully dead whore and my lawnmower with it. Just then, my neighbor, a sometimes obnoxiously friendly old man, peeked his head over my fence and said, "Well, you sure do keep a nice lawn. Mind if I borrow your mower for tomorrow morning?"